Yes.
All right, good. The beginning of the end. Here we go. So now that you have stuck it out all this way, or you have skipped to the end episode, because we will title it this, if you did not choose to listen to all of that or watch all of Game of Thrones, here's our biggest sort of like takeaways, I guess, and sort of things that we'd like to mention now that we made it to the end of the books and the show, even though we mostly just talked about the show. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the books here and specifically the really different stuff from the books that doesn't happen in the show.
yeah, I think for me, big stuff that sticks out between uh both of them is Catelyn dying but not dying. Um, Obviously the books aren't done, so um what else? What else is like that much different?
That one,
Tyrion like goes somewhere that he doesn't because Aegon and Connington like don't exist.
Tyrion's a different character in the books.
Yeah.
Um, so Tyrion's not only like hideous in the books, which is just not part of the show. Like after the Battle of the Blackwater, he like has a huge gash through his face, like he doesn't even have a nose anymore. But you can't do that. So that's okay. The main part is after he kills his dad at the end of the third book. He's not in the fourth book, but he's in the fifth book. And he basically goes on this horrible journey of like fucking prostitutes and then murdering some. Actually, I don't think he murders any, but he does rape some of them, which is really gross. But it's meant to
Yeah.
just be like he's become a villain. Um, you're right. He does go to a different place. He is sent by Varys to meet up with the young Griff, aka Aegon Targaryen, aka Fagon, which is its own completely different plot, which is supposed to probably mirror some of the events of the show, but they obviously will begin and turn out very differently. So Tyrion goes there and is a different character. He's like a very, very sad, depressed, angry character who can't get over the fact that he killed his own father, and that his father was such a scumbag. Um, which in a way mirrors exactly what Tywin was like. Tywin became the man he was because he hated his own father and resented him, and then became a villain because of that resentment, similar to what Tyrion is doing
Became
in
the thing
in the
they hated.
yeah. And so he's with Aegon and John Connington. John Connington was the hand to Aerys, the Mad King, and Aegon is allegedly Aerys' one son, but numerous characters have said that they saw who would be Aegon dead as an infant. And
Head
so
dashed against the wall.
exactly, like many, many characters have said it. And so the main theory that this is the problem with the books being unfinished is that everything has to go on theory for what it's supposed to be. But there's a shitload of evidence that basically says that it's a part of an entire huge conspiracy by the Blackfires, which are very important house and clan to the history of Game of Thrones that are not present at all in the show. Um, and basically that Varys and Illyrio Mopatis are Blackfires who are using a Blackfire child, aka Aegon, to retake the Iron Throne for themselves, but pretending that it's a Targaryen thing. The Blackfires notoriously have had many dealings with the Targaryens where they hated them, and it's very likely in the books that Aegon will take over King's Landing since Cersei is likely to blow up King's Landing, similar to what happens in the show. Aegon then shows up and is a hero for killing Cersei, or at least usurping her. But then Daenerys will show up and fight the Mummers dragon, which is a huge part of Daenerys' plot in the show, is that she is at some point going to have to fight a fake dragon or a Mummers dragon, as they call it, which is likely to be, the fake Targaryen Aegon. But yeah, none of that shit is in the show because I guess introducing a fake Targaryen was too difficult. So they went with this other weird plot. There's stuff in Dorne that never happens in the show either. Like everything that happens in Dorne in the show doesn't happen in the books. But there is a plot in Dorne that they just don't do with Marcella and Kingsguard, whose name I forget. Um, there's Arthur Dane's like cousin or brother who's there. Forget his name, but it might be like he has like a sword called Dark Star. Um, there's like a big fight that happens there, and Marcella gets like slashed in the face. Oberyn's kids basically just fuck a bunch of shit up. It's like a cool story. Um, it just has nothing to do with the rest of the characters or anything. So I guess that's why they didn't include it and instead made the weird buddy cop comedy with Bronn and Jaime fucking around. Jaime's very different in the books.
Yes.
Um, halfway through, when he returns to King's Landing after his ordeal with Brienne, he's an entirely different character and goes different places. So he ends up in River Run where he has to deal with his cousin, and he's a much more reverent, respectful man. He's not as bombastic. He doesn't relapse and end up sleeping with, let alone raping Cersei like he does in the show.
No.
He is on a collision course to meet up with Lady Stoneheart, like you mentioned, and he's had multiple visions, or Brienne has had multiple visions of being with Jaime in the darkness, like fighting together. And so it's likely they will end up at a castle very close to where Stoneheart and the Brotherhood Without Banners are and have some kind of altercation.
Yeah. I want to move into like things that we like the big things we talked a lot in the last episode about like the stuff that we don't like, which is essentially the last two seasons because it's rushed essentially. And
the last 3-4 seasons.
Yeah.
So the last 4 seasons, first 4 seasons is 40 episodes, last 4 seasons is 33. Series is 73 episodes total.
Yeah. But the last two being part of particular disrepute, I would say.
Yeah, I would say there's like
the two before that are
minutes
not
in there.
Yeah, the two before it are not particularly great, but they're not as bad as the last two. With all of that being said, right, because we basically just spent a while bashing those seasons. For what this show has done for television, kind of bringing like filmatic and episodic and like grand scale like fights and fantasy to TV shows. It's unparalleled, obviously. Lord of the Rings clearly comes to mind when it comes to film, but it's not a show. I mean, Rings of Power is out now, but yeah, don't want to go down that tangent.
Yeah, I mean that only exists because this show succeeded.
Right. But that's kind of like the launching point of the end discussion here is the show had top level actors, humongous budgets, ridiculous sets, and then also just grossed like an absolutely ludicrous amount of money from audiences. And a lot of people do have like our opinion of the last few seasons, I would say, but by and large, the story itself, right, like from one man, from George R. R. Martin, is incredible for the world that it is, as well as the amount of characters that are sort of balanced and cantilevered, I would say. It definitely shows a lot of the unforgiving nature of life, and even when you try to do the honorable thing, you end up with your head off. unfortunately, in the world that he's created. But I would say just the reflection that shows also within our world and within our games of Thrones, consistently, I think, like, resonates like quite well.
Yeah, I guess that is one of the themes of the show. It's pretty hard to pinpoint down one concrete idea the show is actually going for, other than like the cyclical nature of rulers. Like, no matter what happens to the people in charge, there will always be another crop of people who understood how to rule who fill that place. Like, there is no real way to affect change in the world, and like radical people who try to come in and usurp the existing system, either because they feel they had a birthright or a really good idea, like, it fundamentally doesn't change what happens, and ultimately violence is required for that change, and the violence is meaningless. Like, war itself is meaningless. There's no glory in battle, and there's no glory in death.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, it's also showing that, going back to the cyclical nature as well. I mean, Bran coming out on top in the end, the fact that he can like straddle both the past and the future. I mean, as well as the present, obviously, but that kind of just shows that the only way of like winning, or the only way of surviving, is by learning from the past and predicting the future. Like, if you're able to do that, then in some way you're able to come out on top, and try to rule in, not necessarily a just or reasonable way, but that seems to be one message from the show.
I,
Like, you
yeah,
could interpret it that way.
I don't know how you get to that. Is like the way that Bran becomes because it's not Bran that's king, it's the three-eyed raven. Like, the
Hmm.
implication is that the three-eyed raven manipulated the entire world into causing this war, and then waited for just the right moment to seize power off of the deaths of many people. Like, that could be one possible allegory from it, is learning from the past to affect the future, but it's not like any character learned from the past to get to where they were. Like, everyone that ends up on the High Council at the end is there by accident, except for Bran, who just
Yeah,
manipulated everything to get to that.
I'm
Or
not saying that that's like definitively like the way that it should be read. I'm just saying that that could be one message.
that's the way I wish it read, but it, like, there's literally evidence against that
I
being what
agree.
they were going for.
I totally agree. Yeah.
That's the main issue with the show, is that the last four seasons have so many mixed messages that it's hard to pull any real concrete meaning out of it, beyond the fact that it's just like, don't you love this type of fantasy action?
Right.
Like, ultimately that's what the show becomes. Ironically, there's way more visceral violence in the first four seasons and more nudity and sex scenes in the first four seasons. Like, the exploitation of violence and sex in those seasons, I think, is more extreme and to a more extreme degree.
Definitely.
Um, and I think that's a weakness of those parts of the show.
Yeah, I
And
was gonna say,
so,
you could pretty much remove those and it would be better. I would say, like, by and large,
yeah, oh, absolutely.
because at the end of the day, they kind of do detract from it, and you're just like, what? Whoa! I don't know if I needed that.
I mean, they add something to the show, but what they're adding to
Definitely.
the show is either like, like, ultimately it's just gratuity. So
Yep.
the framing of gratuitousness in the show changes. So it just changes from being the gratuity of either seeing naked bodies or seeing bodies split open, and changing that to just like gratuitous CGI action and big set pieces. Like, in a way, it's funny that they're like almost the same thing.
What are almost the same thing?
the use of gratuitous violence and gratuitous sex is virtually the same thing as gratuitous action, like meaningless action.
Yeah. Okay.
It's all just like once you see enough of it, your brain just turns off.
Yeah.
Like if you watch like a bunch of Marvel movies all in a row, your brain's just going to shut off when the action comes on because it's all the same like formulated thing, and it's just the same type of computer graphics. And the same thing is true in this show. I think this show got away with it longer because they had to, spend the budget to design a lot of the action pieces from scratch, as opposed to taking the building blocks the movie studios use to make movies, which is why for a long time the show felt fresh. But the show also has some really bad CGI in it before they
It
got
really
to some of
does.
the stuff in the later parts of the show. But even
Yeah.
then, some of it really sticks out. So,
Mhm. Yeah, it both has some. I think we talked about this off air, or you maybe made this point that it has some of the best seasons of television, and then some of the most mixed. Like not necessarily some of the worst, but some of the most
oh,
mixed.
I would just say unambiguously some of the worst.
Gotcha.
I think season 8 is one of the worst like seasons of television ever made.
Just like if you took it out of context, or also because of like what it is incapable of doing and what came before, or both.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Like if you compare like in terms of like what makes a bad season of TV, like you basically have your generic sitcoms where every season is roughly the same, and the only thing that really affects quality is like how tight the comedy is being written consistently within the characters so that everything the character's doing sort of episode to episode is as entertaining as it is consistent. Whereas a bad season of a sitcom is that the character changes episode to episode and it's not very funny, or they're just repeating plot lines. So season 8 of Game of Thrones changes a bunch of characters. Like they just do things that the
Yeah.
established character would not have done before in a way that they're not making decisions. It's just, oh, they were just written to be that way this time.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And
that
like
that's like
the
one of the biggest that's definitely one of the biggest things that sticks out to anyone who understands the characters, I would say.
and
What they're motivated by and what they would actually do in a situation.
yeah, ironically enough, I think the other thing is for as much as the show exists to make death feel meaningless because it's so common, the really, really shocking deaths are the thing that bring the most meaning to the show.
Definitely.
Like the twist of Ned being killed or the Red Wedding or Oberyn being killed. Like these are all like great moments of television that really not only subvert an audience's expectations, but set the show up as something very new and very different than what was established, mostly due to Martin's writing and ability to create very compelling characters, then remove them from the story and have the story still work. Whereas by this eighth season, like I said, there was 1 hour of TV where like six characters we had spent dozens of hours with just die,
Hmm.
and their deaths are meaningless. Like Theon dies defending Bran, which is good because earlier he fake killed Bran, and it's like, well, Theon's not really the same guy. Plus, we don't even know who Theon is post Reek because they never established what his like redemption arc would be like. He doesn't become a better person. He's just still a shitty guy who dies randomly. Like
Yeah,
Jorah just like dies defending Daenerys, but like okay, he just died for no reason.
they're the characters' deaths did mean something before, and then there were other characters who died, and the point of their death was to show that like anyone could die at any point in time, and that death is meaningless within the show. Like they're those two ideas like happening congruently, right?
But then
But
John
then
dies and is
later, yes.
resurrected.
So what I'm saying is then like characters die like for no reason. like the point that they are trying to have, where it's showing that death is meaningless, it actually is subverting the subversion, and then yeah, you're just left with like, okay, that served zero purpose, um, or whatever purpose you were trying to intend is like even worse than it serving no purpose. Um, yeah, I don't really know how to explain that any other way. Um, I think we should move to a place where we talk about some of the things that the either the lasting effects of the show, or also like just some of the like some of our favorite parts.
The lasting, I mean, I'm gonna still have a cynical take on it. Like the lasting effect of the show is functional that you can just tank an entire show and have it be more popular than it ever was. Like the most controversial parts of this show are the parts that the most people watched. Like the most just poorly written parts of the show are the parts people liked the most, or at least were the most in tune to.
Sorry, I just got a text that set my brain on fire. You're gonna have to repeat that.
What this show taught me about TV is the more bad you make the show, the more people will watch it.
Okay, how about the books? What did you enjoy about the books?
I mean, it's the thing that stops the show from working is that in the books they just become more and more and more complicated. And maybe that's why Martin never released the sixth and or seventh book, because they're so complicated that he'll never be able to untangle the plot that he's threaded together. And so there is no satisfying conclusion that anyone will like, let alone that everyone will like.
Right.
But ultimately, yeah, that's what's great about the books. There's just so much going on that all of the characters are intertwined in like various conspiracies. And they have to operate that way because in most parts of the world, like the surviving good characters or characters that you're more likely to root for either have their backs up against a wall or like surrounded by villains. Like the villains are still sort of winning in the book.
Yes, for sure. The book's gestalt, like the it being bigger or better than the sum of its parts, is definitely present. I would say that the because the books are so character driven, that like obviously propels the plot and is the biggest piece of sort of the puzzle as to why the stories are so like resonant and continue to this day, and why people enjoy them so much, which is basically similar to what you said, but also um, the the way that each chapter is written from a different character's perspective, and his ability to write the characters differently, like the way they think and what they say and the way they act and the way they describe something, all the way down to his syntax, but also his diction, like his choice of words within a certain chapter, um, I find to be remarkable, just as a reader. And varying like the scenes on that, his imagery just really draws you in, and like I don't know, at least for me, like I found them to be not more enjoyable than the show because they were better than the show, but just the form of them I enjoyed more than like a movie, honestly. Like the form of a book, like reading it and imagining it, it was just written so well that it was cool to see like a scene, such as either of the ones behind us, and things that were happening like on screen, but like honestly, the experience of reading it and imagining it was better in my mind, just because of like how he explained it and described it.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people say that in general. Like anyone that prefers books to like visual mediums has pretty much said the same thing, where they prefer reading because the imagination is entirely you. So you're doing a lot of the world building. Whereas once it's envisioned for you, it's someone else's idea of something that you may have had an idea for.
Yeah, and I think there is something to be said for the first four seasons that because they follow it so well and are true to that, but they also are true to the world, not just like true to like, oh, this character would do this thing, or oh, they're true to this character. Like they're true to the world itself. That's one of the reasons why they're so much fun.
Well, they're
But
committed to still building the world out. So there's
yeah,
still a lot of like journeying that happens. Like
yeah,
Brienne and Podrick are just wandering through the world. The Hound and Arya are like 2 seasons wandering through the world. Like Tyrion wandering through the world, Jaime wandering through the world. Like they never are able to recapture that, mainly because in the last 2 seasons they just need to get to events. Like they just need to move from place to place as fast as possible to do stuff. But also like th any of the other scenes are not about people moving. It's just them exchanging information that only makes sense if both of them understand the context of the show.
yeah. I still think there's something deeper to the reading of the books than just playing in your own head. Like I'm trying to parse this out and explain it in a way that doesn't give myself credit for imagining it in a way, but more like I'm trying to give him that credit because of how well he wrote it and is able to read and imagine his own writing.
Well, Martin is a way better writer than these people are like filmmakers.
Yeah.
So there's that element that like for as much as the directors on this show do a pretty good job, and there is an actually pretty consistent number of directors in the show
Hmm.
who are known for directing great TV before.
Yeah.
Tim Van Patten is known for The Wire and The Sopranos. Brian Kirk, Brian Cogman, Alan Taylor, um, David Nutter. These guys have Neil Marshall. All of these guys have like directed other great TV shows. Um, Fucking DB Weiss, though. Not sure about him.
Let's let's uh let's move to just because like I guess what I'm trying to say is that the characters are really well written because it's from their first person point of view. I believe it's first person. I haven't read it for a while, but I forget if it's third or if it's first. It might actually be third because the name of the chapter is the name of the character, and it made like say like Brienne did this thing, but then you also still have access to their thoughts, I think.
It's both.
Okay. Um, I couldn't remember. But that and like the descriptions of like the scenes, um, I don't know. It just like is some top level writing to consume. Like I picture being next to like an open fire and drinking like tea and eating like I don't know some food every single time that I read uh, Game of Thrones. That's
Yeah,
just what I imagine.
Martin is an unparalleled world builder, just really
Um,
useful in fantasy stories.
yes. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is just that I'm beating into people's heads like just reading it is super super enjoyable. What I wanted to ask you was that who are your favorite characters? If you had to give your top three favorite characters, who are they?
In the show,
We could do either.
this is a pretty hard question. Like Ned Stark because he dies before they could ruin him. Like the characters who are dead before they ruin, like Oberyn. I don't know. Anyone that's in season 8 is off my list. No one is spared.
Do
Like
you
Davos is a very compelling character from start to finish. That's just because like he's given witty lines of dialogue and is surrounded by idiots.
Do you like Jon Snow?
I like him well enough in the books, yeah. I mean, he's a very simple man. Like he's similar to Ned in that sense, both in the show and in the books. Like in the show, he just becomes such a husk of a character by the end that it's impossible to like him anymore. He's given nothing to work with as an actor, and so there's nothing there for him.
Yeah, I remember there being some like memes about him being bad at acting, and it's like they literally there's like no direction for him to go. Kind of just like Jon Snow as a character, he can't win. Um, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I was gonna say I certainly like Jon Snow a lot. Um, hmm. Ty Tyrion, sorry, not Tyrion. Jamie, I like a lot in the books. Big fan
Yeah.
of Jamie in the books. He's easily one of my favorite characters. Probably because I identify with him on some level about like his hand being cut off. Probably relates to, if I had to think about it, it probably relates to how I like don't really play soccer anymore. So it like feels kind of like I've lost my hand in that way. Like I lost the thing that I loved so much and spent so much time doing, and now it's kind of like trying to come to terms with what I am doing and how I'm making sense of life and sort of the adventure. That was another thing that I actually wanted to talk about this book that is very interesting is that there are many scenes where characters are literally doing nothing except just wandering. And it's kind of funny because I think so many writers or like even readers or people who watch things like that's not very compelling. And George R. R. Martin makes it compelling. Like
Well, it's
it's
because
just
everything's in service of the larger story, usually.
yeah, yeah. And
He's either
that's
building
very
up the world,
impressive.
cementing some thematic idea, or like adding intrigue to why a character is even in the story.
It's just really impressive that you just you can continually have characters, you know, wandering through a forest or they're like in a brand new like location and they're literally just going on an adventure and the adventure doesn't seem like it's all that nuts, but then it does serve some greater purpose, serve something uh more enjoyable to experience.
Yeah,
Um
I mean, ultimately, the greatest frustration with the series is the fact that it took Martin 15 or 16 years to write 5 books, and now it's been 13 years since one came out. Like, we're not getting those books until he dies, and then we're getting weird posthumous releases cobbled together by editors.
yeah.
So, like, we're never going to get a real complete Martin version of what this story is supposed to be. And ultimately, the fact that he hasn't released anything yet means that he's changed whatever he thought the ending ought to be. Probably because his ending was similar enough to what happened in the show that the fans' visceral reaction to it made him second guess himself.
Hmm.
And it's something where, like, I don't know if it's a result of the way that art is viewed by the world now because of stuff like Twitter and social media, and if an artist being able to interact so cleanly with the fans directly
Yeah.
that the fan input would change the material that extremely. But it's also like, in a way, he struggled as a writer for so long that the opportunity to finally sell his work and basically sell out his work and not, have any control over what HBO or Warner Brothers was going to do with it once they started to adapt it. Like, I think he has been critical of many elements of the show, particularly the like last 2 seasons. Um, but like he could always correct things by just releasing the books, and the fact that he hasn't and instead has continued to do other stuff with TV, he just doesn't seem interested in finishing them.
Yeah.
It's just like I think part of what makes the books so good is that they're not complete. like to me, part of the allure now or the quality of the story is all the potential directions it could go, as opposed to any of the ones in which it actually has or will.
That's definitely true.
Because it makes like it's like a double dose of that imagination. Because the books, like reading the books, there's more imagination required than there is to watch the show because it's filling in all the blanks for you. But like the fact that there's also no ending is another element where you have to fill in the blank.
Yeah, and that's something that every writer will continually struggle with. I do think there is something to be said though for the phenomenon you're talking about where the audience starts to creep in and have an influence on the manner with which the story is told or like even the point of the story. So Game of Thrones is quite unique in that category, but it's certainly not going to be the last one. Like we'll see some other show that will come out that is good, is great, maybe, and everyone is watching, and then maybe it gets bad because it's rushed, or maybe it gets bad because the writer second guesses themselves or tries to pay lip service to the audience or something. But
Oh yeah, I
um,
mean this one just had like so many cascading issues that caused the eighth season to be the way that it is.
yeah,
Like the showrunners being like egotistical to the point where they're like sticking it to Martin on certain plot elements or certain like like what happens with the Hound is maybe the worst example of it. Because what happens to the Hound in the books is completely different. In the books, the Hound gets injured in a fight. Like Brienne is not even anywhere near any of that
no,
stuff.
no,
The Hound just gets injured in a fight, and like Arya does leave him because he's like sick and has a festering wound. But then he shows up later because Brienne sees him later digging holes at a cemetery and he's retired, with the implication being that the Hound has finally finished what he was supposed to do in the world and feels at rest,
hmm
having, escorted Arya some distance. But like what happens in the show literally feels like the writers of the show being like, nah, you took him in the wrong direction. So not only is bringing him back like sort of weird in a just strange episode, but like just downright disrespectful to what Martin was trying to do with the character in the books.
definitely.
I suppose maybe Martin always intended to bring him back in the books, but that never felt like the case to me.
No, the Clegane Bowl, like you said, definitely seems to have influenced things.
Well, so uh in the books, Rorge is the guy that has the Hound's helmet because there's someone that has the Hound's helmet like in the Riverlands committing atrocities that is not Sandor Clegane.
Yeah.
And Brienne finds him, and it's a guy named Rorsch. But in the show, the Hound and Arya kill Rorsch.
hmm
And it's another one of those things that leads up to it, where it's the writers being like, no, we have a better idea. We're better writers than you, George, after we piggybacked on your entire world for 5 years. But
Yeah. Catelyn Stark I really like as well in the books. Um, Especially that sort of like mystical shit that happens to her after she is killed and like reanimated and she becomes Lady Stoneheart.
just hangs everyone.
Yeah, it's just like really satisfying seeing I mean this may also um just be a function of the Starks being like sort of the goodies, the good guys in some way. But I also really like Benjen Stark. It may just be subjective because I like when characters become like enigmatic in a way, less readily defined. But it's really fun uh, seeing that happen. Um, yeah, that line is so bad. Who has a better story? That reminds me of like Jim Harbaugh and the Harbaughs. Who's got it better than us? Oh, oh boy. Um, I think we should be good unless you had any other final points. Obviously, Davos is a very enjoyable character, which we mentioned. Davos Seaworth or Seaworthy. I would say the concepts of the characters of Littlefinger and like Varys are really fun to have in any story. The characters who are doing like some sneaky shit behind the scenes and they can influence like all sorts of different things. Um, yeah, just conceptually, that's always a fun thing to have in as a writer. That they could always be doing like clandestine activities at any given time.
Well, like in the show, they are smartly written for a time, and then they both start making weird decisions and abandon their already set in motion plans
Yeah.
to literally do nothing but wait and then die.
Hmm.
Because it's not even that like I would want either of them to like win, like to have their plan succeed. It's just fun to watch characters that are smart or outsmarting everyone else up until a point until, their trickery and deceit and lies ultimately catches up with them.
Yeah.
It just doesn't really catch up with them in the show. Like for
No, it
Littlefinger, it's
doesn't.
just like he knew that the Starks knew what he did, and
He
in
did
the
nothing.
books, like something other than that will probably happen too. But
Sansa's character in the books actually pays off pretty well, I will say. Um, a character that you're not really sure where she's going or if it will pay off. Um, but you did mention this a while back, but George R. R. Martin has been involved in a number of other projects, namely Elden Ring, that he primarily wrote or was consulted to help write. Um, all right, you wanna tie this up?
would you recommend watching Game of Thrones to someone who's never read the books or seen any of the show before?
I definitely would. Yeah, I think it's. I mean, we kind of said this without saying it. It is somewhat of a cultural experience, or at least it was for a certain time. Um, yeah, it's kind of something to celebrate and hate at all in the same vein. Like it's quite a unique. I mean, there's lots of shows that kind of fall off a cliff, but um,
None
I
as spectacularly as this.
this definitely mirrors the Eagles 2023 season. That's for sure. Or the Eagles season mirrors this. Um, but yeah, like I think it is like worth celebrating the parts that are good, I would say. Um,
That to make it into a sports analogy, Game of Thrones, the show, would be like winning two Super Bowls, making a third in 3 seasons, and then in the fourth season losing all your games. That's what Game of Thrones is like.
losing all of your games because all of your players like got hurt on a huge like bus accident or
Yeah,
something.
because We Are Marshall happened to you, like your coach's
Holy
plane
shit.
exploded. Like
Yeah, basically.
I don't know if I'd recommend it. I do agree with you that for what it was at its time, it was a cultural touchstone. I think that's dead now. Like the speed at which the show and the larger story left the zeitgeist was
Mm,
remarkable.
yeah.
Like the only thing I really know about it now is that people nick a living either talking about the lore of the entire story, just because Martin has written other books. He's released other books in this like histories of Westeros and the world, just not the Game of Thrones books.
That's so funny.
I think he's released 4 of them
That's
since
so
he
funny
released
to
the Dance
me.
of Dragons, but he won't finish the Winds of Winter. Um,
Jesus. I mean, like I said, I would strongly recommend the books. I'd still recommend the show, but that's only like if you can sort of get past the end and
would you
celebrate the celebrate.
recommend Lord of the Rings if you knew there were only 2 books? Like Tolkien just died before you could write Return of the King.
I mean, the books are just like super enjoyable. They're a great experience.
The books are exactly like the show in that when you finish it, you will be deeply, deeply frustrated. And if you're not at the end of, not having a complete story with the books or in, the show, like you watch it and you just love it, then like anything I'd recommend to you doesn't matter anyway. We're living different realities.
I enjoyed the experience of reading them. I enjoyed the experience of the chapters of the books. But yeah, it is frustrating that you don't get the whole yet.
Oh, the books are amazing. I would recommend the books. It's just, it's like you watch a movie, but then it ends, and it's like, oh yeah, they shot the end, but they hid it behind a paywall. You have to pay $1 million to watch the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, every Game of Thrones fan has to come to terms with that or not come to terms with it and just blindly celebrate it. Um,
Where's the book, George? Where's Winds of Winter?
maybe one day we'll be able to do an episode on it. Doubtful.
Well, probably. He will be dead in the next 20 years, and they will release that book when he dies. Unless he burns the manuscripts and destroys his floppy disks, like because he still writes on floppy disk.
Sets himself on fire with dragon fire. All right, that's a great stopping point.
Napalm.
Have a good one, everyone. Till next time. Adios.